Whew. I made the switch from the Sony A6500 to the Canon M50 for all of my out-of-studio work. Canon and Sony are kind of the two of the biggest names in the YouTube camera space. Sorry, Panasonic. Now, they are both fantastic cameras, but today let's see why I made the switch. Coming at ya. What's up everyone, I'm the Everyday Dad, and if I can figure it out, you can figure it out. Now, in all honesty, I am a camera agnostic. I really don't like any one specific brand, and I really like almost everything the major camera companies have been putting out recently. Well, except for you, Nikon. I've been shooting with Sony APS-C cameras for almost a year now. I'm very familiar with the ins and the outs, the ups and the downs. Most of those downs involve not having an articulating screen, and honestly, I think they are just really great cameras. And heck, I'm currently filming on a Sony A7 III, which might be my favorite camera of all time. In fact, when I first heard about the Canon M50, I immediately dismissed it as a weak attempt to cash in on the mirrorless craze from a company that didn't really want to jeopardize its higher end cameras by putting too much good tech in a lower end body, which is still kinda true, by the way. Obviously, I ended up getting one because when I'm out filming, I don't like fiddling with the camera. The A6500 is a great camera, but it had some frustrations that vanished the moment I started using the M50. Up front, before either camp threatens to burn down my channel, I do like both cameras, and I think both are great in certain situations. As much as we like to think so, there is not really a perfect camera on the market right now for anything, though the A7 III comes really close. What we're gonna do is we're gonna break this video down into a couple of different parts. Longtime viewers can consider this a smaller pillars of action. But while we're gonna be doing some comparisons, what I'm really trying to focus on is why I picked the M50 over the Sony, and it's not really just gonna be a straight up comparison video. First up, let's talk about image quality. Both of these cameras have APS-C size sensors. The Sony is a teeny bit bigger. They can both do 4K at 24 frames per second. The Sony can do 4K at 30 frames per second. Now what's nice about the A6500 over the M50 is if you're gonna be doing a lot of 4K, it's a bigger 6K image that's downsampled to 4K, meaning that there's even more information packed into each image and it looks really good. Now while the M50 doesn't do that, it's actually an additional 1.6 times crop on its sensor to get 4K to 24 frames per second. You also lose the dual pixel autofocus that Canon is renowned for if you wanna shoot in 4K. But for me personally, these little cameras are my travel rig, and I find myself shooting in mainly 1080p 60 frames per second either way because I like being able to slow down my B-roll. When it comes to slow motion, however, the A6500 does have another leg up over the M50 in that it can do 1080p at 120 frames per second over Canon 720p at 120 frames per second, but it doesn't look great. Your usage might be different, but for me, the 1080p 60 frames per second on with the M50 is exactly what I want out of the smaller camera. A serious negatives about the Sony, however, is they do have a tendency to overheat while filming, especially in 4K. The A6500 is better than my old A6300, and I've never personally had an overheating problem, but it is something to keep in mind if you're considering the camera. Next up, ease of use or fiddliness. We've spoken about fiddliness. Yes, that's a real word, even if I just made it up. And right off the bat, the A6500 has a quasi-articulating screen. That means if you are in front of the camera and you want to see yourself, you need to get a monitor, which means you need to bring batteries and the cable. And if you also want audio, you'll need another attachment, which at that point means I'm probably gonna bring a cage. It is still possible, but you have to add an awful lot if you want to get simple control of seeing what's happening while you are filming yourself. The M50, on the other hand, is super easy. I bring it and the microphone/audio system I'm using. That's it. I can also use smaller tripods because it weighs almost nothing. And not only does it have the ability to let me see myself, but it also lets me change the filming settings from the screen. If you do a lot of this kind of video, you know what I'm talking about. There are a lot of times, so many times, where I change the frame rates for B-roll and then I forget to change the shutter speed back when I go in for my beauty shots. On the Canon, I can see that it's wrong and fix it without having to go back around the camera. I can do it all from my regular position. Now let's pause here really quick. I know a lot of these gripes and praises are on little issues, but in my experience in the last year and a half of running a YouTube channel, little issues eat up large amounts of time, especially when you have to deal with them constantly. For example, when filming outdoors, the A6500 screen is basically useless. As it dims so far, even a little bit of bright light outside, you won't see it. This is in 4K, by the way. The last big thing I want to bring up is camera ecosystem. Now, every month, the gap on these two ecosystems is closing, especially with lenses. Sony has an awesome, though super expensive, range of lenses that can get you some of the best image quality out there. Canon has quite possibly the largest lens selection on the planet, and their EF mount is really the gold standard today. You can always get away with adapters and mount almost anything to a mirrorless camera these days. I'm just a big fan of using native lenses. And yes, I see the irony in what I'm about to say. The M50 natively uses Canon's EF-M mount, which does not have a huge variety of lenses, but you can get an official Canon adapter that lets you use their EF and EF-S line of lenses. When you do this, everything, mainly the autofocus, works perfectly through this adapter, and this little addition opens up a world of affordable EF lenses that can make this little brute a serious workhorse of a travel camera. But if they're both great cameras, why at the end of the day did I switch over? Like I said, I was using my A6500 for 1080p 60 frames per second. At that point, the 6K sensor is not really doing much for me. I was also getting seriously sick of the screen dimming and having to bring a load of extra gear whenever I wanted to film somewhere that wasn't my little studio here. I'm still using my A7 III as my primary camera. It's legitimately my favorite camera ever, and I will continue to recommend the A6300 for people looking to get their very first 4K camera. But if you just want a tiny camera that works with very little extra gear, is almost frustration free, which cannot be overstated how important that is, and just works without much fiddling with it, the Canon M50 wins over just about everything else on the market. Like I mentioned earlier, when I first heard about the M50, I thought it was a joke and immediately dismissed it from my brain. But once I got into this camera, it easily found a way into my regular rotation and my heart. Thanks for watching.